You may have a new place to go to cast your ballot, and stadium funding options continue to surface. Details in Capitol Report. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Capitol Report. I'm Julie Bartkey. The new legislative and congressional district maps were released by the courts on Tuesday afternoon. After much anticipation, lawmakers will now analyze those maps and figure out a new political strategy if necessary. For you, it means identifying if your lawmaker continues to represent you and if you have a different place to cast your ballot. Representative Sarah Anderson chaired the House Redistricting Committee. She's here to discuss those maps and their impact. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's begin, Madam Chair, with the new maps are out. What do you think Minnesota voters need to know moving forward?
Well, first off, they need to figure out who their current legislator is under these new redistricting lines and where their new polling place will be. And all of that information will come in time as the local units of government figure out what new precinct lines are and county commissioner lines and so forth. So there's a couple more hurdles yet to be achieved here before May, but folks should start the process of kind of figuring some of those details out.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the work done by the courts. Yeah. Do you think that those maps generally reflect the same maps that the legislature passed?
No, you know, they were quite a bit different than what the legislature passed in both the House and the Senate. We took the goal of keeping communities as whole as possible as a serious commitment to the citizens in Minnesota. And if you did a comparison, just looking at the House districts alone, under the map that was passed by the legislature, we only split 39 cities. Now you compare that to the plan that the court issued, they split 89, so 50 more cities. So there's quite a bit of difference in the lines that were drawn by the court.
And in your opinion, how did the Republicans fare?
You know, I think for overall, I don't look at it in terms of Republican and Democrats. What I look at it is, you know, it's going to be more challenging for citizens because of all of these different splits. It's going to make it more onerous for local units of government to hold elections because there are more splits. So, I mean, that's my focus right now is, you know, how can we get through this next election cycle in a smooth fashion? It's
typically been the desire of the courts to keep those with similar economic or cultural status together. In your opinion, do you think that the courts did a good job in keeping these groups, as I mentioned, together?
You know, obviously we had a different plan, so you always think that your plan is, you know, the best plan out there. What I struggle with is, you know, I view the political subdivisions as the highest community of interest out there. People identify themselves by what town they live in, what township they live in, what county they live in. And when you're splitting them more than what the plan that we offered, I think that that's problematic. But I guess that's, you know, that's water under the bridge right now. So, yeah.
You know, with the shift of fewer rural seats and more in the suburban and urban areas, do you think this helps amplify the GOP message?
You know, I think what it does is this is just a result of, you know, population shifts within Minnesota. And one of the things that we've been focusing on as Republicans is removing barriers to job growth in this state. And that's some of the challenges that greater Minnesota is facing right now is people are coming to the metro area because they're looking for jobs. Well, if we can, as a state, remove some of these barriers to job growth, not only just in the metro area, but also in greater Minnesota, that just helps our state as a whole.
It's fair to say, Madam Chair, that a lot of work was done by the legislature to put its maps together. Mm-hmm. And I guess I need your opinion. The courts have essentially weighed in for the past 5 decades on this. In your opinion, is this a sign that the current system in place of developing and releasing these maps, is the current system working, or do you think it needs fixing?
You know, I have looked at other states. One of the proposals for Minnesota was to go to a commission system. And what would happen there is that there would be a judge panel that would first look at the population numbers. They would draw their own map and then they would submit it to the legislature for legislative approval. Now, I've looked at other states that have gone to a commission system, California, for example, Arizona. And I just want to highlight California in particular because so many people, when they look at a commission system, say that it's going to be greater transparency. But in California, what they found is people were being hired to provide testimony to get partisan results out of the commission. I think you actually get less transparency under that route because people are operating under false pretenses, thinking that they're going to get a better product and a less partisan product, when in fact they get the opposite. And
What about the idea of just taking the legislature out of the loop completely and just giving it to the courts?
Again, you know, I think that there is value, and we've talked about this before, there is value to having lawmakers involved in this process. We know our areas probably better than most people because we have to travel it. I've door knocked my district multiple times. You know, you get an understanding of what your citizens are like, where the different communities of interest are, and what communities match better together. And I gave you some examples in the past. You've got Representative Karen Clark during the legislative process. She said, you know what, in your map you've split the White Earth tribal nation here in this map. I don't know if any average Joe citizen or even a judge would understand that, you know, but she knows that because she knows her area well. So we made the adjustments to the map to reflect that. And we have a couple other examples of, without the expertise of the lawmakers and their full knowledge of their districts, I don't think that we would have the product that we produced.
So given that you're obviously a little vested in the maps that the legislature did release, I'd still want your overall impression at first blush of the new maps.
You know, though I didn't like the fact that the maps were, you know, split a lot of communities, overall I'm excited about it. You know, Republicans, I think we're going to be heading into the election cycle, and I'm excited about the new territories that are open seats, and I think that we will do well in this election cycle, not just by, you know, what the boundary lines are, but the fact that we've been really pushing on a jobs agenda for the state of Minnesota, and I think that people understand that we're here to get that done.
Okay, Representative Sarah Anderson, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
A bill that would broaden the scope of protecting property and family is taken up in the Senate. The author says her bill makes plenty of sense.
Right now, Minnesota is a duty to retreat state, and if I'm in that split-second moment of a dangerous criminal coming at me and threatening me with violence, I shouldn't have to worry about running. I'll tell you how old I am. I'm 54 years old. I live in the country, and if I'm out in my yard and a 20-year-old kid decides he's going to assault me, I'm not going to be able to run away from him, and I should be able to defend myself.
This bill is about two things. Number one, if we're going to have a Second Amendment, let's make it meaningful. And I am a strong supporter of our constitutional rights and making sure that law-abiding citizens have meaningful rights. Secondly, this bill is really about not what happens in the use of force situation. It's really about what happens in the court of law afterwards. This is about the presumption that the law-abiding citizen has acted in self-defense. The county attorneys and the police can still bring forward evidence to rebut that presumption and can still make their case that it was not a use of force that was authorized here. But this bill is about what happens in the court of law and who gets the presumption. And we believe it should be the citizens that get that presumption if they are law-abiding residents.
When I was 10 years old, we lived in South Minneapolis on 23rd Avenue. And across the alley, one of the neighbors had a very good apple tree. And so at 10 years old, occasionally, I would sneak into the neighbor's yard and steal an apple from the tree. Now, sneak is an operative word here because I entered that property by stealth, and I entered it illegally to take this apple. What this law does, or what this bill does, specifically under Subdivision 4, there's a section called presumptions. And it allows a property owner to presume that if that 10-year-old kid enters the property by stealth, illegally, the property owner now can presume that that 10-year-old poses a threat to the property owner of death or great bodily harm. And you can see the disconnect there from reality because there's no threat here whatsoever. And based on that presumption, now the property owner can use force, and even deadly force, against that 10-year-old apple thief.
One of the many roles of a caucus leader is to try to win seats each election. Well, the new maps add a new layer of work for caucus leaders. We sat down with Senate Minority Leader Tom Bakk to discuss the work ahead. Senator, let's begin with the new maps. They're drawn. How did the Democrats fare?
Well, at first blush, at least, it appears like we got a fair shake from the courts. You know, anytime you don't negotiate something and you hand it over to a third neutral party, you always wonder if you're going to get a fair deal out of it. At first blush, at least, it looks like we got a fair map. My position always was, as long as we get a fair map, I think that The message of Democrats is more representative of Minnesota than what we have seen from the Republicans over the last year, getting rid of things like the homestead credit, shifting K-12 funding, cuts to hospitals and nursing homes and residential group homes, and historic cuts to higher ed. We always felt if we get a fair shot at November, Democrats are going to have a very good election. I feel pretty good about the map and our chances for regaining the majority in November.
And you touched a little bit upon the message right there of the DFL with fewer rural seats and more metro area seats. How do you go and work with the DFL now to try and win back the majority and reshape your message?
Well, I don't know if it's a matter of reshaping. I don't think Democrats have changed that much, and I don't believe Minnesota has changed that much. I still think that the views of my caucus are more representative of the state. Clearly this map, like previous ones in other redistricting, have a number of safe DFL seats that are clearly in Democratic hands. It has a number of safe Republican seats that are clearly Republican districts. But as we expected, there will be a large number, something 10 to 12 seats that are in play, that can go either direction depending on the mood of the electorate. I think that's still the case with this map. The legislature, the majority in the legislature is in play for either caucus, depending on how people in those swing districts feel in November.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the things you've said in the past, especially recently, about your time here in the legislature and the tone it tends to take once new district maps are released. And there tends to sometimes be a hurry up and let's get out of here so we can campaign mentality. Do you think that's going to be the case now?
Well, I think it depends on who you talk to. And I did tell the Republican leaders from both the House and the Senate before we started the session that they would be wise to try and set up the timeline of this session so that the legislature could adjourn and go home before Easter. I still think that's the right approach. I think they will learn after today. They're going to have a number of members in both the Republican House and in the Republican Senate that, based on their new district, are going to want to go home. And there's not a lot that has to happen this session. We've got a budget in place for this year and for next. If the February forecast comes in okay and we see what the new revenue projections are going to be, the only thing really keeping us here, I think, is to pass some kind of a jobs package to try and put Minnesotans back to work. And I'm going to encourage them strongly after the November forecast or the February forecast comes out on the 29th, that if the budget is okay, and I believe it's going to be, then let's get a bonding bill passed and let's all go home and hit the campaign trail, and Minnesotans will decide in November whose views better represent the needs of our communities.
Now, Senator, it's typically the desire of the courts to keep those with similar economic or cultural status together when these maps are released. Did the courts, in your opinion, do a good job in doing so this time around?
Well, that's one of the significant principles that the court uses, is to try to keep communities of interest together. And it appears like at first blush they have done that. We're not surprised at that. So they also did something that we're not surprised at, is they showed almost no deference to incumbent protection. There are a large number of incumbents that are paired. We expected that to happen. Incumbent protection is not one of the criteria in redistricting. We have some Democrats in the Senate that are paired with their colleagues that are Democrats. We have some Republicans that are paired with Republican colleagues. And up north, at least, I noticed in one district, Senator Saxhog from Grand Rapids, who's a Democrat, is paired with Senator Carlson, who is a Republican that represents Bemidji. So there are pairings both within the caucuses and between the caucuses, between the parties.
All right, Senator, last question. The courts typically have had to issue the maps the last 5 decades. So is this, in your opinion, a sign that the current system in place, where the legislature draws them up and then ultimately the courts seem to have the final say, is the system working?
Well, it could always be better. I think what people need to remember is this is all really inside baseball at the legislature. I don't think a lot of people are sympathetic that some incumbents are paired. I don't think the fact that if somebody else represents their community now, it's all that big a deal to people. People are just trying to provide for the needs of their family. That's their primary concern, and who represents them at the Capitol is probably of lesser concern. But you need to remember this is a very partisan thing, probably the most partisan thing that the legislature undertakes, and very hard to reach an agreement on. So it's a good thing we have, in the event we can't reach an agreement, that we have a neutral party that can put a fair plan together, and I believe the courts have done that. Okay,
I do have one last question. You mentioned inside baseball. So in your opinion, moving into the outfield, what do you think Minnesotans need to know as we move forward in this election season, in this campaign season?
Well, I think first, candidates are going to have a lot of work going out into communities they didn't represent before and introduce themselves, explain to new constituents what's important to them, and I would argue even more important, listen to your new constituents about what the issues are in the new communities that you now represent. And to voters, analyze the positions of the candidates that you're going to meet carefully. Elections matter, and the priorities of this state are different depending on who's in control at the legislature. So to all of the voters out there that are, whether you're being represented by the same person, challenge them, tell them what's important to you as a voter and a member of the community, and that's especially important if you've got a new elected official that you haven't met before. Reach out to them, introduce yourself to them so that your concerns are heard by your representatives.
Okay, Mr. Minority Leader, thank you for your perspective. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Will they or won't they? The question of whether lawmakers will take on a stadium issue this session continues to filter through the hallways at the Capitol. Meanwhile, negotiations for a new stadium are ongoing. The governor met with Vikings owner Ziggy Wilf on Tuesday and continued talks with the focus of putting a new facility at the current Metrodome site.
Mr. Wilf, will it be Minneapolis ultimately?
We are talking at this time for the Minneapolis site, yes, the Metrodome is.
Is Arden Hills totally out of the picture at this point?
I'm never going to say never. Again, we're very close on hammering a deal right now for the Minneapolis location at the Metrodome.
What's the amount the Vikings will put into a Minneapolis project?
Again, it's to be negotiated, but it will be in excess of $400 million.
On Thursday, this group of Senate Republicans detailed their financing plan for a new stadium.
The Vikings are going to be treated the same as we would treat any other business that we want to attract or keep in this state. The bill will be site neutral, no gaming money, no general fund money, and no general taxes. It'll be privately owned and privately operated. It'll contain a phase out of the statewide business property tax, and there is no requirement for any local contribution. The financing, as I mentioned before, paid for by the Vikings, the NFL, Minnesota businesses, user fees, and the state. The state's portion will be, again, the same as we do for anybody else.
Halting potential Medicaid fraud on a federal and statewide basis. That's what brought this coalition of lawmakers together.
Last year, one of the nonprofit HMOs in Minnesota suddenly returned what they described as an overpayment of $30 million to the state of Minnesota. We do not even know how this HMO nonprofit came up with this number. We do not know if other nonprofits owe repayment as well. And we don't know if nonprofits have been overpaid for years. The lack of federal oversight is absolutely shocking. The GAO has acknowledged this, and we are now going to take steps to correct it.
At the state level, we clearly have the same concerns. We need transparency, we need accountability, we need the independent third-party audits. We have more than a dozen reports that the various plans put together now, but the question is, do they mean anything? And I brought this point up in the recent hearing in the House, the joint hearing between the two HHS committees. I highlighted the General Accountability Office report, and I suggested to them, and certainly we'll ask this question in the Senate, I suggested to them, when you're hearing about CMS certifications, when you're hearing about reports that are done on the plans and what's been provided, ask the question, does it mean anything?
We want to reach out to anyone that has brought forward information. The nonprofit HMOs in Minnesota, we want to ask them for their input. Again, we are not here to accuse them, simply to hear what their side of the story is. We want to hear anyone who has reservations or concerns about the current reporting requirements that are going on and the usage of these monies, and we intend to work with the states. Again, we don't think that this is just Minnesota that has a problem. We think this is probably, if it's uncovered here, we think there's a very high likelihood that these issues could be handled otherwise.
Senator Sean Nienow's proposal is intended to promote financial integrity. He's here to talk a bit more about his bill. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Senator, let's begin with the crux of your legislation. It has 3 different bullets: an independent audit, data, and making sure there isn't really a conflict of interest with the entity that sets the rates. So if you can, explain in layman's terms what each of these bullets is intended to do.
Sure. Well, right now, the term we use is there's a black box. The state pours money into it for these programs. The HMOs take that money and then they manage the care for these public plans. But we really don't know what's going on inside of that. We get more than a dozen reports and audits and such, but the question is, do they really amount to much? Because the question is the underlying data. Is it really solid, good, usable data that gets us good information, or is it just data? We don't even know if it's correct or incorrect, or if it's the data we should be looking at. For example, the General Accountability Office at the federal level, they did a review of, kind of like the legislative auditor here. They did a review and did a report for CMS, who certifies the rates that are paid for these, and basically said they have no way to know if what they're certifying is good or bad or otherwise.
And so what do you intend to do to try to clear up some of this confusion?
Well, the 3 bullet points that you said, one is a third-party independent audit by people that really know what they're doing. They have the expertise in this. And there are entities that do this across the country. They work for the FBI, they work for the General Accountability Office, they do forensic accounting to dig down, really take a look at what's going on to make sure everything's right and tight and something's not amiss, or being manipulated or whatever. But in order to do that, you have to have access to what we call the granular encounter data. If Mrs. Jones goes in because she had a broken leg, I don't need to know that this Mrs. Jones went in to get the broken leg fixed, but I do need to know how many Mrs. Joneses went in for broken legs, how many Mr. Joneses went in for gallstone surgeries, and what all of that cost, so that you have the underlying data, a good base of information to work with, and for the outside auditor to review everything. And then the third point, really, I liken it to if you were to go into court and you're the defendant and you found out that your lawyer is also the lawyer for the plaintiff. That's a bad idea. And that's what the third bullet point is. It has to do with our actuary, the company that sets the rates. There's no prohibition in law right now for our actuary to be the actuary for the plans. And the plans can benefit or lose money based on where those rates are set. So we should each have our own actuary, just like in a court of law, you should have your own lawyer.
And it was recently reported that there was about $30 million in overpayments to UCare, which were paid back. That's one of the HMOs in question. And you stated in the news conference that essentially you don't know if there is a problem, but you don't know if there isn't one either. So do you intend to flesh out whether or not there really is a problem, or is this intended to kind of put any potential problems aside and just prevent them in the future?
Sure. Well, to really boil it down into a soundbite, last year we were looking at this, and what I tell people is last year something didn't smell right to me. This year a whole lot more information came out without going into details. I can see smoke. So now the question is the house on fire or isn't it? If you were in your home and something started to smell funny and then you saw the smoke, you'd be checking it out. And you might find out that it's the neighbor's house that was on fire, and then you're relieved. But you might find out it's your house that's on fire and you want to get that put out right away. That's the point where we're at here at the state of Minnesota. Is the house on fire? If so, put it out. Make sure that whatever caused that fire, that problem goes away.
And, go ahead.
And if it's not, then we know that it's not, and we've done our due diligence.
Okay, Representative Michelle Bachmann did state repeatedly during that news conference that if these overpayments are happening here in Minnesota, they're likely happening in other states with larger populations. So if that's the case, what do you hope happens?
Well, my focus is specific to Minnesota, but the Congresswoman is looking at what I've proposed here for Minnesota and elevating that up one step and saying if it's good for Minnesota, it's good for the rest of the country as well. It's a relatively minimal cost in the perspective of the money we spend on these programs to ensure that everything is right and tight and legitimate. For example, in Minnesota, the estimate I've received is that out of our pocket, the state of Minnesota, maybe cost us about $300,000. The feds would match that, so it'd be a total about twice that price. But to put that in context, the HHS budget is about $11 billion. So $700,000 is a fraction of a percent of that budget.
How do you hope your legislation complements or supplements whatever will be done at a federal level?
Well, I think they probably would mirror each other. More than likely, if we were to pass this legislation and the federal legislation would pass as well, our legislation would probably just put us in compliance.
All right, Minnesotans want to know, are their dollars safe, their tax dollars safe in particular? Do you think your legislation will indeed promote financial integrity in this area?
Absolutely. That's the whole point, transparency and accountability.
Okay, Senator Nienow, thanks for coming on and discussing your legislation. We'll track it, and we appreciate your time.
All right, thank you. Have a good day.
A bill to create a new type of corporation in Minnesota was introduced by this bipartisan group of lawmakers. The Public Benefit Corporation, or B Corp bill, is designed to fit in between for-profit corporations and nonprofits.
They could become another tool for addressing the social and cultural concerns where private capital and government resources often seem limited. At a time when public budgets are squeezed and society's needs are growing, we must begin to find additional ways to achieve our shared goals in society. The new Public Benefit Corporation option will attract private capital from investors wishing to meet social needs or take advantage of opportunities to use their money in a way that benefits both themselves and their community.
This is a purely voluntary structure. People who choose to start a business this way would have the flexibility to do so, and people who choose to invest in them realize we may not get quite the same rate of return, but in exchange for that, we can make sure that we are doing whatever the corporate charter is proposing to do. Mainly, we're going to say we may be paying our employees above the market rate because we think that's the right thing to do. We might feel that we're buying more responsibly produced resources or something. And so for the environment or whatever sake, that's a decision we as a corporation want to make. It's purely voluntary. I think the bipartisan authorship of this suggests that people on both sides of the aisle recognize the importance of this, and we hope we can pass it.
It was a different kind of animal making its presence known in the Capitol hallways this week. The 8th annual History Matters Day was a chance to showcase the work of the Minnesota Historical Society.
Minnesota Historical Society is here showcasing some of the great offerings that we have as part of our network of historic sites and museums, including activities at the History Center, our historic sites such as Kelly Farm, that is part of the capital bonding bill this year, and also some of the other things that people maybe won't associate with the Minnesota Historical Society, such as our press or other historic sites such as the Lindbergh House or Split Rock Lighthouse.
That wraps up this week's program. From all of us at Senate Media and House Public Information Services, I'm Julie Bartkey. Thanks for watching Capitol Report.